Favorite movie as a kid? I love the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Just say Toy Story or something. It's okay.
Why are we lying about our favorite movies? Like, I know it's not 2001: A Space Odyssey. You know it's not 2001: A Space Odyssey.
I'm so tired of, oh, what are your four favorite films? J'ai vu La Petite.
Do people even like movies anymore? Of course, the idea that some movie fans aren't into classic or highbrow cinema is nothing new. I've been there myself and believe that it is to some extent just a natural part of a developing passion. But at the same time, I think we also can't deny that our general relation to cinema has been changing, and that this change has been negatively affecting our willingness to engage with movies that are less conventional, more challenging, and that just altogether demand a more proactive curiosity.
I do think there is a sense of duality in the text, and I
Forgive me if I don't tell you the latest Marvel movie or Legally Blonde. No, I think that I bring much more insight to this discussion.
It's not bad to admit that you like movies that just make you smile.
Indeed, the way we watch movies, the way we go about our lives in general, is vastly different now than it was 20 years ago. And today I want to examine the impact that all of this has had on us, the audience, in an attempt to unify the variety of interconnected developments that have been changing our relation to cinema, and offer a more comprehensive understanding that explains, among other things, why we've become so obsessed with relatability and characters who are literally me. Why we're increasingly reducing the value of movies to the social, political, or moral messages they contain. And why it is that even when we do genuinely want to develop our knowledge of and passion for cinema, we still end up behind our PC, watching something like Argyle while playing Fortnite on a second screen. This is the death of cinematic curiosity, brought to you by Mubi. Part 1. Into the Literally Me movie era.
Barbie, wake up.
After the initial hype surrounding Greta Gerwig's Barbie settled down, as film critic Caitlin Quinlan wrote in her fascinating article, "If it makes you cry, it must be good," there remained one central question. Who was the film for? Indeed, many of the discussions and critiques that followed the socially conscious adventure through Barbie Land seem to inevitably circle back to different notions of what Barbie set out to be in the first place. To some, its feminist themes felt too simple to be meaningful beyond serving as an entry-level introduction for younger audiences, though others found there was also plenty here about nostalgia, adulthood, and identity, both for women and for men. For Quinlan, however, the answer doesn't really matter. The important thing is that Barbie grossed over $1 billion at the box office. Clearly, it was a movie for everyone.
Ken is me.
And I'm Barbie.
The success of Barbie, as Quinlan argues, exemplifies a growing trend in storytelling and filmmaking, one that is increasingly focused on and obsessed with relatability. It's a larger sign of the times really, just one part in a greater cultural shift in which our attention has become one of the most valued resources, and in which relatability is proving to be the most effective way to mine it. In his New York Times piece, Why Do We Obsess Over What's Relatable?, which is also mentioned by Quinlan, Jeremy D. Larson writes, "Relatability is the chief psychological lubricant that glides you thoughtlessly down the curated endless scroll of your feed. It is the coin of the digital media realm, a mealy concept that delights advertisers and publishers alike because it all but guarantees to garner a reader's attention." In this sense, relatability is the natural next step from likability. It's that which transforms a merely positive attitude towards something into a much stronger, much more intimate relationship. It's the reason why so many major brands now act like they're people. Why politicians, CEOs, and other leaders seem more concerned with performing how much they're just one of us, instead of actually demonstrating that they are capable and conscientious individuals who we can trust to perform a difficult job. And why every actor in a bad production now seems to be in on the joke.
You definitely did not see me in Madam Web.
Best season ever!
Because yes, with cinema too, relatability has become key. Going back to Quinlan's article, she observes how stories have increasingly been stripped from specificity and intimacy in favor of generalized themes and references that are designed to relate to as many people as possible. Barbie demonstrated this not only through its critical and financial success, but also by clearly achieving some kind of cultural crescendo with a grand speech that was praised by audiences for being, above anything else, extremely relatable.
You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining.
Now, you might wonder, weren't America Ferrera's words about womanhood not relatable precisely because they weren't generic and instead spoke to the experience of a specific demographic? Well, yes and no. While representation in cinema is a good thing and can definitely add specificity to a movie, what we've been seeing a lot of in the recent years is a sort of capitalization of representational politics. The rise of inclusive stories that, as Quinlan notes, have the appearance of being specific by centering marginalized identities, but which at the same time also tend to deny their protagonists anything more than superficial characterizations, with the result being a series of characters, story moments, and grand speeches that all manage to wrap bland statements of empowerment in the trappings of a more specific relatability. It's as if studios are carefully calibrating the exact right balance between being specific enough to get the accolades for representation, but not so much that they actually have to sacrifice marketability. All this, however, is not just an issue with the bigger studios and franchises. It's also the smaller and independent movies that, according to Quinlan, are suffering from underwritten stories and underdeveloped characters because of their appeal towards relatability.
Hi. Hi.
In Celine Song's Past Lives or Andrew Hayes' All of Us Strangers, two independent successes of the year, viewers learn little about the central characters other than how they have very broadly been shaped by the equally very broad concepts of love or loss. Claims that these questions of identity are part of the film's design and not unambitious writing cop-outs are spurious. Now, I must say that, as someone who was deeply moved by All of Us Strangers, and as someone who has made a whole essay on past lives that specifically argues how the question of identity is indeed a part of the movie's design, this is the point where the argument really hit me personally, and where I found it to be most challenging. For while I agree with the general observation that movies like these do rely heavily on the notion of audience self-recognition, that they serve to a large extent as avatars or blank canvas narratives, as Quinlan refers to it, onto which we can project our own feelings and experiences, I also can't help but wonder, is this really such a bad thing? Is it not in fact one of the most powerful traits of cinema that it can invoke this kind of relatability? That it allows us to momentarily pour ourselves into other characters, into other stories, and in that process, to vicariously experience some kind of catharsis or transformation? Again, the answer seems to be yes and no. Of course, channeling your inner being through cinema can be deeply meaningful. In fact, my whole channel wouldn't exist if I didn't believe that was true. But I can also see the larger issue that Quinlan seems to be getting at. That this relatability, this beautiful and rather spontaneous relational quality that can develop between a story and its audience, is increasingly being commodified, that it's increasingly becoming a deliberate business tactic, an exploit that co-opts our natural capacity for emotionality into a broader quest for attention and profit. It's all commodified in the end, Quinlan concludes, and so the mass entertainment and the smaller indies meet, both capitalizing on emotion. And besides the problem that cinema and everything really is becoming blander and blander as a result, a growingly homogeneous and shapeless mass in pursuit of maximum reach, overlit and underwritten, easy to understand, easy to consume. This has also been having real implications for us and for our relation to cinema as a whole. The way we look at movies, the things we expect from them, it's all changing. Or rather, it's being narrowed down. It's all being recontextualized, reframed through the lens of relatability, of what we understand, and perhaps above all, of what we agree with.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
If you've spent enough time in movie circles on the internet, you've probably seen that meme where seemingly random movie characters are now being described as literally me. though coming in a variety of forms relating to a variety of demographics. The most popular version, which I've also seen being referred to as Sigma Cinema, is the one with men connecting over a collection of movies with edgy characters who they perceive to be, well, literally them. Ranging from relatively recent releases such as Joker or Drive, all the way back to older classics like Fight Club and Taxi Driver. The unifying quality here, it seems, is a shared frustration with and subsequent feeling of alienation from our present society and humanity in general.
I simply am not there.
At this point, you can probably already see that the defining trait of this relationship is relatability. But what's interesting here is that this new categorization, or I guess memification of cinema, wasn't part of any deliberate marketing strategy. It wasn't some top-down corporate concept. Instead, it arose specifically out of the audience, out of people who found a new way to approach and connect with a variety of movies. And as such, we can also begin to observe the resulting effects of the commodification of relatability on our own cinematic attitude and psychology. For one notable characteristic of these literally me memes is that they don't really promote engagement with the actual content of these movies. They're not treated as an invitation to get at the root of why these characters are the way that they are, or even to examine the exact nature of their frustration beyond a few generic observations about the current state of the world.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
No, it's merely about relishing in the relatable emotion at the surface, the disillusioned loners, the sad rainy atmospheres, all that which captures the same feelings that the literally me audience already had, while maintaining a willful ignorance towards everything else. In other words, it's relatability being used as a comfort blanket, as a means for a sort of affirmative complacency. A way to validate one's beliefs and feelings without actually having to examine them, let alone confront them in a truly meaningful way.
I just don't want to feel so bad anymore.
And this leads us into the second issue, which is the increasing usage of cinema as self-righteous moralism. While the literally me memes are a rather specific example, they do point to a bigger, more fundamental problem in the way we've come to engage with cinema. Because to return once more to Caitlin Quinlan's article, this increasing shift towards relatability by selling audiences on stories they will understand, and the growing expectation of comfort and affirmation that has resulted from it, is only worsening an already troubling trend. Which is the rise of a cinematic culture that no longer welcomes discussion and conflict as a fundamental part of the art form, and as an inevitable aspect of our engagement with it. Or to put it like this, the gradual conditioning towards relatability and towards desiring affirmation also extends to our more essential values and beliefs, which has caused us to increasingly obsess over good movies and bad movies, not in a filmmaking or storytelling sense, but in a moral one. And so we ask, does this movie align with my values? Does it reflect what I believe to be good and true in the world? Or does it conflict with my beliefs? Does it contain ideas that I perceive to be uncomfortable, harmful, or just flat out wrong? Was it conceived or executed in a way that I find misguided or transgressive? In short, to what extent is this piece of media, as the now so often used buzzword goes, problematic? As with relatability, the idea of critically discussing the content of a movie is not bad in itself, quite the opposite in fact. Again, my channel wouldn't exist if I didn't also believe that movies have an educational function, that they can directly and indirectly inform our worldview, which naturally implies that they can therefore also promote ideas that are more regressive, that serve to uphold misguided, outdated or harmful stereotypes that do warrant a more critical examination. But an essential part of this process is the willingness to embrace discomfort, the act of allowing yourself to be challenged and to really consider conflicting ideas and beliefs, which has never been an easy thing to do, but nowadays it does feel especially difficult. It's like it's become increasingly normalized, even if only on a subconscious level, that instead of welcoming critical discussion as an invitation to broaden your horizon, it is treated as an attack that has to be deflected. An obvious example of this would be the dismissive response against inclusivity and representation.
This is the person they hired to play their woke Snow White.
Where now you either eat this pronoun shit, eat this gay lesbian witch shit.
Let's go over the top 5 woke Hollywood disasters of 2023.
While there is, as we've already discussed, a meaningful conversation to be had about the capitalization on marginalized peoples and their stories leading to a sort of forced or shallow diversity, there are also plenty of examples in which we find subversions of or commentaries on storytelling tropes and sociopolitical norms that are actually done very well, or at least thoughtful enough to inspire real dialogue, but which are nevertheless immediately brushed aside as being woke, another often used buzzword. While the problem of wokeness, as I guess it is called, generally pretends to only refer to that forced kind of diversity, in reality it rarely comes with any actual argumentative substance and rather seems to have become just a reflexive response against any form of diversity. On top of that, in many conservative circles, wokeness has come to indicate more than a mere undesirability, a sign that a movie just isn't for them. It has also come to imply a moral negative, meaning that wokeness is, in their view, something that is actually harming cinema and society as a whole, and which in the most extreme cases is therefore perceived as something that must be actively combated instead of merely ignored. But we see such overreaction or over-obsession on the extremer ends on the other side of the spectrum too, where I can't help but feel stories are being overvalued for their perceived educational function, for how well they serve the cause, so to say. And in my opinion, reductive perspective on the art of cinema that only encourages more ambiguous and more contentious works to be ignored. As if the very presence of any form of conflict, contradiction or complication, whether it's an outdated trope, a perceived lack of inclusion, a misguided casting choice, a slightly too controversial subject, or some other minor transgression, is such an irredeemable sin that it automatically disqualifies a work from being engaged with or valued. And yet, it's this relational development that I nevertheless find highly fascinating and that I believe warrants further examination. Because whereas the anti-woke movement mostly tends to be rooted in bigotry, what we see here, I think, are the deeper implications of decades of neoliberal individualization, the greater societal shift towards the idea that people are completely autonomous, that they can and must master the whole of their lives on their own. Because when combined with the growing dominion of the consumer society, the result is not only a world in which the individual has become the expected driving force of all action, but also one in which that pursuit of self-actualization, and therefore all of our moral action and any form of self-expression really, has become almost entirely reframed through the act of consumption. In other words, what we've been experiencing is the slow internalization of the idea that the burden of the world's conscience rests on our shoulders, and that to express the right beliefs means to consume the right products and to watch the right movies. Aside from this trend ignoring that individuals are still limited by time, place and circumstance, intrinsically bound to others, and generally exist within greater societal units that determine the course of our collective lives as much, if not more so, than any one individual can. It is also here that we risk another form of affirmative complacency, as the very act of endorsing some product or brand, or in the context of this discussion, championing a piece of media that conveys something that we consider to be positive, or inversely condemning it when it contains something we perceive to be harmful, can become its own source of self-righteous satisfaction. It encourages the audience, as David Mamet once articulated in his critique of Schindler's List, to reward themselves for seeing that the villain is bad, and in the liberal fallacy of feeling this perception is a moral accomplishment. And this is a risk because it can so easily become a sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop that turns watching cinema from a means to an end to a purpose unto itself. where instead of treating movies as a way to engage in self-reflection and perhaps even change one's actual behavior, it becomes satisfying enough to merely observe and acknowledge, to agree with the works that affirm our beliefs, and judge those that don't. In fact, I'd say it's easier than ever to get stuck in this loop. For if there's one thing that late-stage capitalism does very well is incorporating critiques into itself. You know, it's why we have big studio anti-corporatism, status quo revolutionism, all giving the illusion that some kind of upset is on the horizon and that you're proactively engaged in the cause, while in actuality you're just passively consuming. Moral action as the non-contentious shaping and reshaping of the discourse, articulating and rewriting what is already understood and agreed with, as if one more formulation, one more cinematic depiction is somehow going to make the difference.
What we do is just create sympathy. We create admirers. We don't create followers.
To be fair, it's hard to make one generalized statement here because the extent of the issue really depends on the individual. Whereas a particular movie might just be a facilitator of complacency for one person, to another that same movie might be a genuine catalyst for action, a transformative experience that actually motivates them to make a significant change in their worldview or behavior. But still, when looking at it in broad strokes, it does feel like the works that are most embraced are the ones that do fall into that sphere of relatability, of the easily understood and the easily agreed with, while those that present themselves as less legible and more ambiguous struggle to truly become a meaningful part of the conversation. In her article, Quinlan does bring up 3 anomalies, 3 movies from last year, Killers of the Flower Moon, May, December and Tar, that all in some way implicate their storytellers and their audiences into the fabric of that text in a way that subverts easy relatability and promotes a certain degree of discomfort.
Byron got her drunk, and I did the rest.
A narrative gambit at the end of Killers sees the director take aim at the notion of mass entertainment and his own implications in it, the sensationalization of true crime in particular, and the ubiquity of morbid curiosity in today's audiences. May December was similarly interrogative of this, while Tar's cancel culture commentary also pointed the finger, even if who it was pointed at was up for debate.
I mean, unfortunately, the architect of your soul appears to be social media.
Personally, I would also include Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest here as a work that examines the nature of human evil, not just in a historical sense, but also in the here and now, as it ultimately provokes us to critically question where our own zone of interest ends, what darkness we are hiding behind its rose-covered walls, and what evil we are casually ignoring, even though its cries permeate our everyday waking existence. The point is, as Quinlan concludes, that these movies defied becoming simple objects to be easily consumed or spewed out by audiences hungry for self-righteous satisfaction, and were all the more interesting by having built into their design a sort of meta-level conflict, a conflict not just in the text, in the story of the movie itself, but also in the form, in its very relationship with the audience. And more fundamentally, what I believe unites these works and others like it is that they seem to share the same conviction that today seems to be so eagerly denied, that history is messy and that human beings are complicated. We are filled with contradictions, with values that we unwaveringly adhere to in some aspects of our lives, but completely ignore in others, desires that we may wish we didn't have but that affect our actions nevertheless, and biases that prevent us from truly considering the parts of ourselves that most need critical examination. They reveal how, at its center, there is something illegible, impenetrable about the human condition, and about human society as a whole, something that cannot be reduced to easily understandable truisms, neatly defined moralities, and other passively affirmative certainties, and subsequently invite us, as uncomfortable and unsatisfying it can be, to really sit with these contradictions, these unresolvable impossibilities, because it is here, in this mystifying obfuscation, that we can't help but turn inwards, and where, somewhat paradoxically, a more honest and more intimate truth can emerge.
Wisdom is holding two contradictory truths in our mind simultaneously.
You give in to the rhythm, every time. Tension never breaks.
Naturally, it's a mode of engagement that demands vulnerability, a willingness to open oneself up and invite conflict into one's inner being. And while it might be easy to conclude that this is something that we all just need to be doing more of, I do believe we have to consider that there's a time and place for this. That there are certain external and internal conditions that need to be met in order to be truly ready for such active self-reflection. But here too, things aren't as they used to be. And this is where we get to the outer edges, the all-enveloping context within which everything else we've discussed so far is taking place. And that is the problem of the overwhelming constant stimulants. In an interview with Cormac McCarthy, the famed author of, among other works, Blood Meridian, The Road, and No Country for Old Men, McCarthy observed that while people will apparently read mystery novels of any length, the indulgent 800-page books that were written 100 years ago are just not going to be written anymore, and people need to get used to that. If you think you're going to write something like the Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick, go ahead, nobody will read it. I don't care how good it is or how smart the readers are. Their intentions, their brains are different. Now, while McCarthy comes across as a bit hyperbolic here, he does seem to speak to something that also relates to cinema, which is the idea that changes in a broader cultural landscape also affect how we perceive and engage with certain pieces of media on an individual level, that they can rewire our brains, so to say. At this point, we've talked a lot about this shift towards relatability, both in the sense that this is increasingly what cinema is offering, as well as in the sense that this is increasingly what we seem to desire. But as for the why of it all, we have to consider our relation to cinema in more practical terms, or the where and how we're meeting the movies in the first place. For all this easily consumed relatable content is not just being sold to us by corporations in some conscious transaction in a store, or sought out by ourselves in some deliberate quest to satisfy a need. No, nowadays it's just constantly and quietly fed to us by algorithms on the many online platforms that have come to dominate our screens and, in a very real sense, our entire lives. By now we're all familiar with it, the endless stream of content curated specifically to us, all day, every day. Limited access has become overabundance. The chance encounter has been replaced with precision targeting. It obviously feeds into our conditioning towards relatability and comfort. After all, if that's the stuff that's always right in front of us, then that's what we're going to consume, right? But it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not just that relatable content is ubiquitous and easily accessible. It's also becoming a sort of navigational quality in this sea of overabundance. I'm sure you've had this too, where you want to watch something but you become stuck in that browsing mode, just scrolling down movie after movie, platform after platform, until that limited window we had to actually watch a movie has already closed. Unlike traditional television where you just tune into whatever's playing, now nothing starts until you click on it, and every option is just one brick in a giant wall of content. It's somewhat of a paradox. We have more access than ever before, all of cinema right at our fingertips, pre-organized even to our taste, and yet the barrier for engagement can feel higher than ever. Choice may equal freedom, but clearly, too much of it is crippling. No wonder we so often end up going for the low-hanging fruit, the easy pick that is clearest in its promise and needs the least consideration. And no wonder we can't get ourselves to watch a 90-minute art house piece, but we'll binge a whole season of the latest trending show over the weekend. It's not a lack of time that's the issue. It's constantly having to choose, constantly having to re-immerse ourselves, that we want to get a break from. But it gets worse, because it's not just our entertainment, it's the whole of our lives that have been reshaped like this. Always connected, always engaged. Ours is the age of constantly being exposed, constantly being locked in, the age of depression and burnout. It might be too soon to have this discussion, as relatively speaking we've only barely entered into this new phase of modernity, so please treat this only as a preliminary hypothesis. But I can't help but wonder to what extent the value of cinema and art in general, or our willingness to engage with these, is lessened because we're already so constantly overstimulated and so constantly pulled into every conversation. Take the pandemic, for example, one of the greatest global events in recent history. And yet, are you really aching to relive it in a movie? To be drawn in some complex artistic discussion about it? Or are you also still in that state where you, as most movies seem to reflect, kind of want to pretend it never happened? To me at least, it definitely felt like by the end of it, people weren't just tired of the event itself and the direct impact it had on them, but were also just so exhausted from the constant discourse around it, which was just a 24/7 onslaught of discussions with everyone fiercely debating, in good faith and bad, though mostly bad, mortality rates, lockdown effectiveness, vaccination programs, international differences, long-term health risks, psychological effects, sociological effects, they could have done this, they should have done that, the what do you think, who was at fault here, who can we blame, where do you stand, what do you think? It's not that these questions don't matter at all, but it's just too much and too fast. For just as you feel like you've parsed enough information to get a sense of what's going on and to be able to start separating the important bits from the empty shouting, the next issue is already here and the flood of noise begins all over again. It's like being trapped in a swarm of locusts moving from one crop field to the next. There's just no real escaping it. It's all invasive. And it feels like it's been quietly breaking down something sacred about cinema too, which is that idea that movies always offered a distinctive space that you consciously and willingly enter into for a distinctive experience. You know, to watch a movie is to cross a certain threshold, both in a literal sense as you enter into a movie theater or settle in on the couch at home, as well as psychologically as you mentally prepare yourself, even if only subconsciously, to be transported into a story and to open yourself up for whatever it offers. What really becomes of this when that transitional ritual has been desecrated? When we already are in that liminal space, in that state of contention all the time? Again, it's no wonder that we so often end up going for the easy watch, that we've come to treat cinema as an escape. But perhaps the greatest tragedy here is that we're not even really doing that. For me at least, if I had a long and stressful day, I'm not seeking out true escapism in the form of movies like The Lord of the Rings or Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, something that truly takes me out of it for a while and will have genuinely nourished me by the end of it. Because the thing about actually having fun is that it's also an active form of engagement. And when you're tired or overstimulated, that's not what you want. You want to be disengaged. You want something that grabs your attention enough to distract you, but not so much that you can't also scroll down social media while you're at it, do some chores around the house, or indeed, play Fortnite on a second screen. It's a phenomenon that's been getting some attention. For example, in her article Psychology of Concentration, Why the World is Now Addicted to Background TV, Kaylee Dray found people would increasingly turn on something that is easily consumed or that they've already seen loads of times, just to have some background noise, like a mild sedative. It helps, as one of her interviewees explained, to drown out the inner monologues, which can become annoying and even anxiety-inducing at times. Clearly, this is not using cinema as an escape. This is using it as mindless comfort. Now, I realize this is all starting to sound a bit bleak, and especially for a channel that is specifically about the potential for and dynamics of conveying something meaningful through cinema, it's a future that doesn't look very bright. But keep in mind that this is just one hypothesis, and that while it may seem to forewarn some kind of fundamental collapse, it might just as well merely signify a temporary upset, a momentary lapse that is only going to remind us of what we actually want, what we actually need, and which in time will lead us back towards true nourishment. I have no doubt that balancing out our lives against this current phase of modernity is going to be one of the bigger challenges of our time, one that I can't possibly begin to pose a meaningful answer to. But still, I do have faith that, at least when it comes to the movies, all this is not going to be the absolute death of cinematic curiosity. Maybe it is true that new times require new perspectives on what the relationship between cinema and its audience can look like. Maybe there are some traditional ideals that we need to let go of, some new ones that we need to embrace. But then again, both the Brothers Karamazov and Moby Dick are still being read. Great thought-provoking movies are still being made and still being appreciated. In some ways even more so than ever, as they can help us to navigate the noise, to clarify a world out of focus. Obviously there is some timeless quality here that is never fully going away. But why then all this alarmism? Why proclaim the death of cinematic curiosity when it is in fact not dead at all? Well, I think because for so many people today it can absolutely feel like it is. And they might want some understanding of why that is, and a reminder that it doesn't have to be that way. I know I did. For while it might seem like I wrote this video just to examine some broader cultural trends and maybe even to take a shot at some groups who aren't treating cinema as they should, in reality though, I made it just as much for myself. Because I too have been drawn in by and arguably grown to overvalue the comfort of relatability. I too have misused movies as an easy source for moral satisfaction, as a way to delude myself into believing I was a better person than I actually am. An issue which I've also explored in another video relating more specifically to masculinity and false ideals of the heroic self. And I too have been postponing so many movies that I know will actually offer something of value, to instead mindlessly settle for the cinematic equivalent of empty calories. And I wish I didn't. I wish I wouldn't waste so much time like this. You know, once in a while is fine, but it was getting too much, and something had to change. Not only because it brings me no real pleasure and in fact only tends to leave me frustrated, it also simply contradicts the basic ideals that I want to live my life by. There is so much beauty in cinema, so much value in having our experiences, our inner beings reflected back to us. So much transformative power in challenging ourselves with new perspectives, in broadening our horizons, and so much joy in just truly being transported into the world of a story, truly losing yourself for a moment to another reality. And I guess if there's one simple yet potent source of hope here is that you can get this back, or at least remind yourself of this. Just as a simple walk in the forest can be instantly grounding and nourishing, I have found that it just takes one reinvigorating cinematic experience to remember everything that made you feel so passionate about cinema in the first place. And while you may not always be able to hold on to that spark, some days it is enough to rekindle that flame and keep it burning, to find yourself back in a movie-watching habit where you are once again driven by real curiosity, and where cinema becomes truly exciting again. This year alone there have already been a number of movies that got me so enthusiastic that I've been diving into cinema like I haven't done in a long time. Rewatching a variety of classics, exploring some fascinating avant-garde stuff, and just really making the time and space for new cinematic experiences. One movie that's definitely going on my favorites of the year list is The Settlers, a Chilean historical epic about an indigenous sniper who is brought along on an English military expedition to secure the lands of a wealthy estate, but which quickly turns into a violent manhunt for the native population. While it's not a direct adaptation of Cormac McCarthy, the author who I mentioned earlier, in spirit it does come very close to Blood Meridian, the one novel of his that has been deemed unfilmable. For at its heart, The Settlers is a savage tale of colonialism and genocide. While obviously thoroughly violent, It's never exploitative and reflects this brutal part of history like the landscapes that enveloped it. Cold and quiet, yet strangely captivating, as if you can't help but be drawn inwards. It's the kind of movie, as we also talked about earlier, that effectively makes you part of its subject, that makes you reflect on the darkness resting within all human beings, and on the greater forces that bring it into motion. It was just a deeply meaningful experience, and I wouldn't have found it if it wasn't for Mubi. Yes, they are the sponsor of today's video, and if you just want to go ahead and check out The Settlers, which is playing exclusively on their platform, be sure to use my personal link to get an extended free trial. But if you want to give me an extra minute, let me tell you the real reason I've been so fond of this online cinema. Because what I realized as I was writing this video is that Mubi might be the one platform that doesn't just algorithmically cater to your comfort, but instead is centered around actual curation. I've said this before in previous Mubi spots, you know, it's a curated online cinema streaming hand-picked exceptional films from around the world. But these last few weeks, the value of this has just become so much more explicit, as I found that the best way to keep my cinematic curiosity active is to immerse myself in the various categories that Mubi offers, and really dedicate myself to go deep into a certain genre, era, or theme. You'll discover that there's this sort of accumulative effect where the more you trigger your cinematic curiosity, the stronger it gets. And where the broadening of your horizon also comes with the expansion of appreciation, or at least with the expansion of understanding. Because of course the goal is not necessarily to like everything, it is about developing taste and insight, and for this, a movie that doesn't quite work for you can be just as informative. So yeah, to conclude, I'd definitely recommend becoming the butt of the joke of those disgruntled TikTokers. Go watch The Settlers, go try and find that French movie called... And if you're gonna do so on Mubi, do use my personal link to get 30 days for free. That's mubi.com/likestoriesofold to claim your extended free trial.